You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Bryan Cutsinger. Bryan, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So our topic for today is a paper Bryan wrote about seigniorage in the Civil War South. I normally have to, I give background, I ask sort of basic setting up questions so that you in the audience can get up to speed on these things. But I know from my listening data that a lot of my listeners are American, and I'm Canadian, so I didn't grow up learning about the Civil War. So when I ask background questions, it's because I genuinely don't know a lot about that era. So Bryan, bear with me. How about we start by setting the scene? Could you tell me what the sort of monetary system of the pre-Civil War United States looked like, just to set up your study of seigniorage during the Civil War?
Certainly. So it really kind of varied by state. So there wasn't necessarily an overarching system prior to the Civil War. So there were states that had state banks, state chartered banks, that is. Some states had kind of quasi-free banking systems and whatnot. So it was kind of a hodgepodge of various different banking systems that varied basically by the legal structure that existed in each state. Now, that's not totally correct because of not necessarily not totally correct, but because of the first and second banks of the United States, they obviously had some influence as well. But by the time the Civil War rolls around, the Second National Bank is defunct. And so you have various different banking systems that varies by state.
Okay, and the laws restricting cross-state banking, those were in place at the time, correct?
So I don't know. This is a great question. I don't know that there was actually federal law that restricted it as much as there were state laws that basically said, in order to do business here, you have to be, say, chartered here or headquartered here. I don't actually know the actual answer to that question, but that's my understanding.
Okay, so America has many different states, not the full 50 at this time. They each have their own separate banking system with their own separate currencies, correct?
That's correct. Yes. So different banks can issue their own currency. So what you would have would be different banks in a state, for example, issuing banknotes that could be then redeemed for gold or silver, typically. And so these banknotes, in some cases, would trade at par with one another, and in other cases, some notes would trade at a discount relative to others, depending on, for example, how far away the note was trading from the bank, maybe the reputation of the bank and whatnot.
Okay, so I can imagine this working pretty well in a society where people don't travel long distances a lot. Maybe if you were trading across multiple states, there could be some transaction costs introduced by having multiple different monies. But getting back to the main topic of your paper, seems like it would be difficult in this kind of setting to fund something big and expensive like a war.
Yeah, so the interesting thing that happens at the outset of the war is that both the North and the South adopt or rely on the printing press to a certain extent. So most people are familiar with the greenbacks. Those were the notes that were essentially printed by the North to help fund the war. Initially, those were also redeemable for gold, but it became very obvious very quickly that there was simply not enough gold to go around once they started printing a lot of those notes. The South also printed a lot of notes, and those were known as Graybacks. Now, one of the reasons that the South does this is that it lacks any type of formal taxing infrastructure. So you can imagine, for example, the North is retaining whatever fiscal capacity it had prior to the split between the North and the South. So its ability to collect tax revenue, for example, is going to be more robust than, say, what was going on in the South. And in fact, initially, when they tried to collect tax revenue, the Confederate government essentially had to rely on the state's own taxing apparatus, what the states use to tax their own citizens for their own revenue, and basically gave them a kind of a discount on what their individual state level tax liability would be if they would rely on that rather than having the Confederate government try to collect taxes itself. So as a result, because they didn't really have that strong of an apparatus, they had to look to other means. And really, there's only two other means. One is going to be basically trying to raise money by issuing bonds, and the other is going to be printing money.
Okay, so I read in your paper that the North didn't rely on seigniorage to nearly as great an extent as the South. So why did the two, countries? I guess it's controversial. Why did the one country and the one group of no good rebels, or depending on your perspective,
sure.
Use different means of financing? Why was the North so much better able to finance through bonds, I believe?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right off the bat, the thing that kind of got me interested in this topic is if you compare basically what it was or the amount of revenue that each side derived from seigniorage, you see a pretty big split between both countries. Or territories, however you want to define that. But basically, you have both belligerents, let's say. And so if you look at the North only collects about 16% of its total revenue from printing money. The South, on the other hand, depending on how widely you want to define money, and the reason that this is an issue is whether or not you want to include the interest-bearing Treasury notes that they issued. So the South, a subset of their currency, had notes that actually bore interest. They also had non-interest-bearing notes as well. But the South collected about 61% of its total revenue from seigniorage. So obviously, right off the bat, there's this massive discrepancy. Now, if you go look into this, what you'll see is that the North relied primarily on bond finance to pay for the war. Now, the source of this, to a certain extent, this goes back to your questions at the beginning regarding kind of the structure of the pre-Civil War banking system. One of the things that contributes to this is that in 1863, the North passes the first, I believe it's 1863, passes the first of the National Banking Acts. Essentially, what this does is that it makes it so that if you're a bank and you want to issue currency, you need to back up a fraction of that currency, actually 90% of the amount that you issued, with U.S. government Treasury bonds. So imagine you put yourself in the position of a national bank. You're going to have to buy bonds from the U.S. federal government as essentially collateral for the notes that you're issuing, up to 90% of the notes that you're issuing. So what does that do then? Well, that obviously increases the demand for U.S. government Treasury debt. And as the demand for bonds goes up, obviously the price goes up and the yield goes down. So partly what the National Banking Acts do is they make it easier for the North to find a ready buyer of its Treasury securities. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why then the North relies more heavily on bond finance. The South tried to issue bonds as well. In fact, that's what they started off with. But part of the problem was that the South basically, they had a bunch of bond issuing or bonds approved by the Congress. They then turned around and went to the citizens of the South and said, how much will you pledge to buy? And so what ends up happening is that a lot of the Southern farmers pledge to buy a large fraction of these bonds, and they do so in the spring, right? They don't have the money yet. Remember, it's an agrarian society. So they're pledging to buy the bonds, say, in August, for example. But they're pledging to do so in April of 1861. Well, one of the things that ends up happening in the meantime is that the South adopts this strategy to try to get England and Europe to come in on their side of the war, which is that they self-impose a cotton embargo on themselves. So what ends up happening is they're thinking, well, if we can deprive the Europe and England in particular of the cotton it needs for its textile mills, well, that will induce them to fight the war or to enter the war on their side. Well, what this does, of course, is it creates a glut of cotton in the South, right? That pushes prices down. So August rolls around and the farmers are basically destitute. So the farmers that pledge to buy all these bonds had to come around and say, actually, not only can we not buy the bonds, they actually asked the government for a bailout, the Confederate government for a bailout. The other issue that complicates this is that at least initially, the bonds were the coupon payments were supposed to be made in specie, right? So they're supposed to be made in gold, right? But very, very quickly, the South ran out of gold, in part because it needed a lot of that gold to acquire the goods and services it needed to fight the war from Europe. And obviously, Europeans were not very keen on taking Southern Treasury notes, so they demanded gold instead. The gold leaves the South. And so now what ends up happening is that the South couldn't make gold coupon payments on its bonds anymore, and instead was paying it in Confederate Treasury notes, which of course were over the course of the war were exploding. So even the value of your bonds were falling pretty rapidly. So it was very difficult for the South to raise revenue via issuing bonds.
It's amazing to me that they would embargo themselves prior to the Union blockade. It just seems, well, it seems insane that you would not sell your main export to try to help you raise money.
Yeah, it's definitely an odd strategy. I haven't looked into it enough to know. Maybe there's some political economy things going on there that I'm not super familiar with. But yeah, it is. It certainly strikes you as an odd strategy. I mean, and then you combine, of course, the Anaconda Plan, which was the Union's blockade of the southern ports. And then you really put yourself in a pretty big bind, right? Because the primary way you raise money has now been almost completely cut off. And you're stuck with basically a primarily agrarian society that didn't really have the industrial capacity necessary to produce, muskets and mini balls and gunpowder and cannons and all the things that you need to fight a war.
Yeah, and this strange thing. I mean, economists have been pointing out. I think that was one of. I don't know if it's Adam Smith or Bastia or who it is who pointed out that protectionism, when we want to destroy our enemies, we blockade them, but then, somehow during peacetime, we use protectionism to blockade ourselves. And, how can it be that, how can these two things be consistent? And I guess that's a very clear illustration of that they're not.
Yes, absolutely. So I've always heard that attributed to Milton Friedman, but it wouldn't surprise me, of course, if Friedman got it from Bastiat or Smith. But yeah, the old saying is that we do to ourselves in peacetime what we do to our enemies during a war. That seems a little backwards, but that's what we do. So this cotton embargo then had a pretty not good effect, a pretty disastrous effect on the South's economy, which just compounded the problems they were facing.
So was there an issue that presumably whichever side lost the war was not going to be able to pay back its bonds, or at least, well, the South was seceding, right? So had they won, they wouldn't have conquered the North. They would have, forced a favorable peace where the two, countries were separate, in which case both sides could have paid off their bonds, but conditional on the South losing the war, which I think anyone at the time would have viewed that as the most likely outcome, being the much less populous and poorer of the two. Was there an issue that people lending their money to them maybe didn't expect it to be paid back?
So that's an interesting question. Both with respect to bonds, but also to the note. So the general consensus, from what I could tell from reading the literature on this, was that the South basically did, at least, for example, in foreign markets, the South did as best as it could, given all of the issues that you just brought up in terms of its ability to acquire funds from abroad, buying via issuing bonds. But you're right. There's this issue of the victory is kind of asymmetric depending on your perspective, right? So for the North, victory means reunification. If you're the South, victory could simply mean a negotiated settlement, a peace treaty, or even reunification, but with some concessions to slaveholders and other members of the South, right? So there's this whole literature, not just on bonds, but also it's called the war news hypothesis. And so one of the things you have to keep in mind with the Southern banknotes, unfortunately, I don't have an image of it in the paper, but the Southern banknotes themselves were actually not pure fiat money. They were actually credit money. And what I mean by that is that if you go look at a Confederate Treasury note, which you can find on pictures of on Wikipedia, they say on there to in various lingo, basically that this note will be redeemable in specie 6 months after a peace treaty with the Union. So essentially, the value of the Treasury notes themselves kind of hinged on people's expectations of Southern victory, in addition to the quantity of those in circulation. So this was an interesting thing because the value of essentially these assets hinged on people's expectations of Confederate victory.
Yeah, and I've seen other research actually on the market of for slaves. Economic historians, I don't recall exactly which one, but an economic historian looked at what was the discount in slave markets as the war went on, and didn't see much of one. It seems like the people buying and selling slaves were very overconfident about the South's chance of winning, but possibly when it's possible that people are just overconfident about these things, or they're only hearing good news and never bad news from their government about the war. Do you see any? Do you have a fine enough sort of data to see fluctuations in these prices as the South either wins or loses battles, or as the tides of war sort of shift?
We do, actually. So in our paper, we don't, because we're looking at primarily what's going on with the issuance of Confederate Treasury notes. Now, essentially, the Confederacy is like a failed state, right? So it doesn't have the best data. So what we have are essentially 15 observations of the quantity of Confederate Treasury notes in circulation. These are quarterly observations between 1861 and 1865. There are, however, different price indices that have been built. So the first one that I'm aware of was put together by Eugene Lerner, who was a student of Milton Friedman's in the 1950s or 60s. I forget. He has an essay in Friedman's edited volume on studies in the quantity theory of money. So he has a monthly wholesale price index of the Eastern Confederacy. We use that, but then the other price index we have is actually more modern, and it comes from two economists, Burdekin and Wiedenmeyer, that looked at gold price quotations from the Southern newspapers. And that data, I believe, is weekly. So they actually go and look and see if we can find evidence of the market responding to essentially what you would call turning points in the war. So what were the major turning points? So Wiedenmeyer finds, for example, 4 events that the market regarded as quote unquote turning points. One is Antietam / the Emancipation Proclamation. So Antietam happens in September 1862. That serves as basically the impetus for the Emancipation Proclamation, the full version of which is issued in January 1863. So that the relevance or the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation is essentially that prior to that point, it was unclear whether victory, quote unquote, what that actually looked like. Was it a negotiated settlement? Does the South come back into the North with some concessions or whatnot? What the Emancipation Proclamation essentially does is it's Lincoln and the North signaling like, look, the only way this ends is either you beat us to the point where we're no longer willing to fight you, or you surrender to us. And the institution of slavery is essentially done, right? There is not going to be a reconciliation that leaves the South's institutions intact. And as a result, what you see is that essentially makes people less willing to hold Confederate Treasury notes. They start spending them off. They start trading at a discount. The other turning points are not altogether surprising, are going to be the Battle of Gettysburg, and then also the Union's finance and conscription bills. So the Union creates a draft. The Union also creates these war finance measures, of which the National Banking Act that I mentioned earlier is part. And essentially it does the same thing. It says, oh, look, it appears that the Union is creating the legal institutional infrastructure necessary to fight a long war successfully, thus making it less likely that the South will be successful. And again, these notes start trading at a discount. And then the final one is the third currency reform, which we talk about extensively in the paper, that the South adopts in 1864. Again, notes start trading at a pretty heavy discount following that turning point. So we actually have pretty frequent data that allows us to look at the effect of these major events on the value of the grayback.
Yeah. So Yeah, it's really great that historians have been able to get weekly level data on something like that. I know it's sometimes hard to get data just in the last few years, but
Yeah.
going back over 100, you sort of really appreciate any time you get anything definitive and clear like that. I notice from the graphs in your paper that the two price indices that you mentioned, the Lerner one and the Burdekin Wiedenmeyer. I don't know
Yeah,
if I'm
Bedeck and
pronouncing those
Wiedemeyer.
right.
I
I
believe
know.
that's how it's pronounced.
Okay. Yeah, Burdekin. Okay. I noticed that they actually show a fairly pronounced difference. You'd think that two price indices, even if they're constructed differently, would they kind of show that they move in the same direction, but there's a big difference in the levels, particularly in 1864. Could you speak to why there's such a discrepancy?
So I'm not sure. This is an interesting question. I think part of it is going to have basically the Lerner index is appears to be much higher than the Verdeck and Wiedenmeyer one.
Mhm.
Why that is, I'm actually not all that certain. I mean, it could be that because the Lerner index is a wholesale price index, that maybe there's something peculiar about the goods that are included in that index that makes people's behavior vis-a-vis those goods and their exchange of notes for them different than what we see with gold. I don't know. But the Burdeck and Wiedenmeyer series it's not so much a price index, right, as it's actually just the grayback price of gold, whereas the Lerner index is a composite index of a bunch of the wholesale prices of a bunch of goods. So it could be that for whatever reason, the goods in the index behave differently, or people's behavior with respect to them behave differently than it did with gold.
Yeah, and I assume that gold markets weren't going crazy during this time, and gold is, a commodity. It's sold on a global market, whereas wholesale goods in the Confederate South, when they're a war economy and they're being blockaded and General Sherman is sacking Atlanta and all these things, you can imagine that those things would affect the price of goods.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that's probably another factor that contributed to it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the quantity theory of money that as being the sort of context that Lerner was constructing his index. I noticed that the Confederate money supply doesn't rise nearly as much as either of these price indices. So what's happening with inflation?
So that's a great question. So there's an interesting thing about the South, which is, as I mentioned earlier, their currency is actually not a pure fiat money, right? It's a credit money. So it's a promise to pay the bearer some amount of gold at some point in the future, sometimes 6 months after a peace treaty with the Union. I think some other one said 2 years after a peace treaty with the Union. So in a sense, it's not a pure fiat money. And because of that, there's not the standard one-to-one relationship that we would tend to expect per the quantity theory of money, right? That's assuming that the growth rate of velocity and the growth rate of real income are moving together, right? Such that there's a one-to-one relationship between the growth rate of the money supply and the price level. So two factors that are contributing here. One is obviously real output is falling. We have no idea by how much because there's no reliable estimates of GDP of the South during this period, but it's not unreasonable to conclude that output is indeed falling. And then the other factor is, like I said, people's expectations of Southern victory. So you can see there by 1864, it's pretty clear that people are looking at the market and saying, or looking at the South's chances and saying, look, I don't know that these notes are going to be redeemable for much, right? If anything, in fact, they may not be redeemable for anything if the South isn't successful. So basically, people are spending them off in more and more quickly as their expectations of Confederate victory continue to diminish. So we end up seeing kind of a delinking of the money supply and the price level that would appear to be inconsistent with the standard predictions of the quantity theory. Now, this has been kind of a controversy in the literature on this topic, which is to what extent does the Confederacy offer kind of a test of the quantity theory of money? So in Friedman's view, in his volume, The Studies in the Quantity Theory of Money, he points to Eugene Lerner's research as essentially showing, like, look, the quantity theory of money held. The South adopts this radical or very drastic currency reform in February 1864, which I know the listeners can't see this, but in the paper we have this graph. You can actually see there in the second quarter of 1864 that there's actually deflation. Right? It's not just a slowing of the price of the growth rate of the price level. The growth rate itself becomes negative. Friedman basically hung his hat on this point and says, look, this is more evidence of the quantity theory of money, even in this kind of highly chaotic and whatnot environment. Now, subsequently, there's this war news literature that develops and says, well, wait a second, actually the value of the notes was a function of people's expectations. And then subsequent research came back and said, well, there's something to that, but there's also evidence, and this is done by Burdekin and Wiedenmeyer. They have a paper in, I believe, it's in the American Economic Review called "Inflation is Always and Everywhere: A Monetary Phenomenon," Richmond versus Houston in 1864. And they basically say, like, look, well, why don't we actually compare what's going on with gold prices in Richmond and Houston following the currency reforms? And the reason that this is important is that following the Battle of Vicksburg, or the fall of Vicksburg, the Confederacy is actually cut in half. And so if the value of the notes is determined entirely by people's expectations of Confederate defeat, then we wouldn't expect the currency reform to have a differential effect on either side. But what in fact we see is that the currency reform did have an effect on the rate of inflation in the eastern part of the Confederacy, and it did not have an effect west of the split in Mississippi around Vicksburg, basically showing that inflation continued to be a function, at least partially a function, of the quantity of Treasury notes in circulation. So what we get then is that the value of the note is kind of a function of both things. One, the quantity circulating, but then also people's expectations of victory.
Okay. So I want to go into more detail about these currency reforms. The one you mentioned was the 1864 one, after which, I'm looking at the graph right now, there was deflation. But that was the third currency reform in the Confederacy. The first one was in the fourth quarter of 1862. Could you talk about, like, how exactly was the currency reformed, and what was what motivated them to make these reforms?
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go over the technical aspects of them in high detail, because these things are really convoluted. So I won't go into excruciating detail. We'll just talk about them kind of at a 30,000 foot view, and then we have a certain argument about the motivation behind them. So I'll get to that once we go over the currency reform. So basically, by October 1862, prices in the Confederacy are about 420% higher than their pre-war level. The Secretary of the Treasury, Christopher Memminger, he warned lawmakers at the time that the quantity of notes in circulation would soon be double what he considered to be acceptable. So he believed that the economy could support essentially $150 million worth of money. That would not lead to an out of control inflation, basically, I think is the way he's thinking about it. So Memminger kind of has a crude version of the quantity theory of money in the back of his mind when he's thinking about these things. Congress then responds to his request in October 1862 with the first currency reform. And so essentially what the currency reform did was the following. It said that Treasury notes issued prior to December 1st, 1862, could be exchanged for 8% bonds until April 22nd, 1863, after which point they could only be exchanged for 7% bonds. So just to make that clear, you could have always, up to April 22nd, 1863, people could have always exchanged their notes for 8% bonds. What the currency reform did was basically says, following April 22nd, 1863, you're only going to be able to exchange them for 7% bonds. So partly what the South is trying to do here is restructure its debt. It's trying to shift out of Treasury notes and into bonds, right? So because if we can get people to buy the bonds or exchange their notes for the bonds, then we can get inflation under control, and we can rely more on bond finance than on seigniorage to fund the war. Now, what happens, though, is that because the law is passed in October, but doesn't go into effect until 1863. March 18 or April 1863. Note holders spend off all of their money, right? So it actually temporarily increases velocity, which actually makes inflation even worse, right? Because everyone's trying to spend them off. It actually would have been better if the Confederate government had just surprised people. They woke up the next day and say, "Surprise! Your notes can only be exchanged for 7% bonds." But that's not what they did. So there's actually an increase in inflation temporarily. But then once the law actually goes into effect in April 1863, there is in fact a temporary reduction in inflation. But it's important to keep in mind that temporary reduction was not enough to offset the increase in inflation that ensued in the interim period between when the law was passed and when the law went into effect.
So just to be clear, when they announced the policy, it was like a buy now before the sale ends kind of thing. Everybody wants to exchange their notes for bonds. How does that increase inflation? People valued the notes less because they knew they weren't going to be able to?
Yeah, so let me be a little bit clearer there. So what I mean, what actually happened wasn't that they went and tried to exchange them for bonds. It was that they knew that if, for example, maybe you don't want to hold bonds, you'd rather actually hold real goods, right? So one thing you do is that if you know following April 1863 that your notes are not going to be worth as much as they were prior to April 1863, you go and exchange your notes for foodstuffs, right? Or clothing or furniture or whatever it is that you can get your hands on. So that's what happened. It wasn't that. I mean, some people exchanged their notes for bonds, but a lot of other people just tried to exchange their notes for stuff, right? For real goods. And in that way, that would be another way of essentially protecting yourself from what was essentially a partial repudiation of the government's debt. Does that make more sense?
Yeah. So people knowing that money was going to be worth less in the future, tried to spend their money and bid up the prices of real goods in the process.
Exactly.
Okay. So what's the second currency reform? I see it happens in the first quarter of 1863. Was it similar to the first one?
It was. So prior to the reform even going into effect, right? So remember, the first one passes October 1863, but it doesn't go into effect until October 1862, but doesn't go into effect until April 1863. In January, Secretary Memminger again urged the Confederate Congress to adopt additional measures to reduce the quantity of currency in circulation. And they responded again. This time, what the law essentially said was that those notes issued prior to December 1st, 1862, could be exchanged for 8% bonds until April 22nd, 1863. So that's still consistent with the first reform. And then 7% bonds until August 1863. So the major change here was that, according to the first reform, it basically said you could exchange for 7% bonds following April 1863 into perpetuity. But then they turn around and they say, actually, you only get to do that until August, after which point you can only exchange those for 4%, or excuse me, after which point you can't exchange those for bonds, period. So just to kind of re-go over this, since I know it can be kind of convoluted, the second reform says, look, you can take notes issued prior to December 1st, 1862. You can exchange them for 8% bonds until April 22nd, 1863, and then for 7% bonds until August 1863. But if you wait until after that point, you can no longer exchange your notes for bonds. Now, those notes will still be tax receivable, and the promise to pay in gold printed on the note will still be honored, assuming, of course, that the Confederacy is successful, but you will not be able to exchange those notes for bonds. The second part of the reform says that those notes printed after December 1st, 1862, and April 6, 1863, can be exchanged for 7% bonds until August 1863, and then 4% bonds thereafter. So it's almost like a phasing out of notes that were issued earlier in the war, and then in favor of some new notes, plus trying to push people into bonds. But the second reform removed comparatively little currency, and therefore did very little to actually reduce inflation. So it really didn't have much of an effect.
Right. But following both of these reforms, just the amount of seigniorage that the Confederacy is able to collect just plummets. Looking at your figure 9 in your paper, they were collecting a lot of revenue in seigniorage through 1862 and into the first quarter of 1863, and then it just falls off a cliff.
It does.
After
it does.
that point.
It does. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we think that probably is the case. One is these currency reforms, the first one in particular. The other one is that we have to bring back in the war news hypothesis here. So what's going on? So you can see in that figure 9, right, we have the Battle of Antietam, which, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of the impetus for the Emancipation Proclamation. So to the extent that impacted people's expectations of victory, it's not surprising then that the demand for money would fall a little bit, right? So that's also going to affect the amount of seigniorage that the government can collect.
Okay, yeah. So you can't collect seigniorage when people expect you to lose the war. You can do it pretty well if you're expected to win. But so those currency reforms happen around the same time as this important battle, and so it would be hard from an econometric standpoint to separate the two in terms of the effect on seigniorage, but it seems like the war news is the more likely candidate.
Yeah, and so we, in our regression, we try to account for that. We can talk about that in a little bit if you'd like, but we try to disentangle that effect the best that we can. But again, you have 15 observations, and then there's a lot of confounding factors here of actually trying to tease out which factor dominated, which one was more important. It's very difficult to say for certain in this particular case of the first and second reform.
And so, so the first reform is saying that putting a deadline on 8% bonds. The second reform is putting a deadline on 7% bonds. So what exactly, how did the third reform in early 1864 work?
Okay, so this is first of all, it's the most convoluted and it's the most significant. So basically what happens is by December 1863, prices in the Confederacy are 2,000% higher than their level in January 1861. So in basically 3 years, prices have gone up about 2,000%. Memminger demands that Congress do something. He states explicitly that the currency must be reduced. Now, the members of the Confederate Congress make a variety of reform proposals. And the key point that we're making in our paper is that all of these were basically a disguised form of debt repudiation, right? Remember, because of the peculiar nature of the currency, it's money that the government owes to people, right? The government's going to have to, if they're successful, they're going to have to exchange these notes for gold, right? So it is a form of debt, essentially. Now, the average proposal that was offered in the Confederate Congress would have had note holders receiving only $1 for every 10 that they had lent the government. So that's a pretty substantial haircut for you to take if you had been holding Confederate Treasury notes. And this is going to be important to our political economy argument that we can talk about shortly. But let's go back to the currency reform here. So basically, what happens is that there's a debate in Congress over how large this should be. The House, the Confederate House, passes a very drastic reform, at least initially. The Senate doesn't go for it. The Senate kind of haggles with themselves over what they should do, but really they can't come to any agreement. So what ends up happening is they get a a conference committee together, right? So let's get a small group from the House, a small group from the Senate, and see if we can come up with some type of proposal that makes everybody happy. And essentially what it does is that it repudiates essentially 2/3 of the Confederate money stock, in addition to a bunch of other things. Like I said, I won't get into it because it treats all these different levels of notes with different rules, so it gets very convoluted. But basically, it's the same type of thing they're doing before, which was they're trying to encourage people who are holding notes to exchange them for bonds, and at the same time reduce the quantity of Treasury notes in circulation. Now, critically, what's going on here is that the pattern of support for these things essentially varied with whether or not the representative came from a state that was either on the eastern seaboard or Alabama. So kind of the interior of the Confederacy versus its exterior of the Confederacy. So we kind of have a split in support for these different rules, or excuse me, for these different types of reforms. But basically, like I said, what ends up happening is that the initial proposal that comes out is drastic in the sense that the initial proposal would have had the entire existing Confederate money stock repudiated by August 1864. That wasn't popular with the people who lived in the interior of the Confederacy. Again, this isn't altogether surprising. Imagine that a significant part of your total asset portfolio was made up of this currency. Essentially, what's going on is that you have the government saying that, yeah, in August, that is just no longer worth anything. So you're not going to be too thrilled with that.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed is that in the wake of that reform, so what reform did they actually end up going with? Presumably they didn't repudiate the entire money stock.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is on the last day of the last session of the first Confederate Congress, they passed this compromise bill. Essentially, what it is, it splits non-interest bearing notes into 4 categories, and it depended on essentially the denomination. So whether they're less than $5, greater than $5, greater than 100, whatever. But basically, it said these various notes could be exchanged for bonds up until a certain point, after which point all notes of a certain category would be taxed at 100%. So basically like a partial repudiation, right? These notes they're no longer going to be tax receivable. You can't use them for anything. They're essentially worthless. And that happened to varying degrees, whether both in terms of the timing and in terms of what they could be exchanged for, which, like I said, it gets very convoluted because it's not just every single note. It depends on the denomination. Some denominations are going to be taxed at 100% at a certain point in time, others at maybe a later point in time, and then some of them can be exchanged for bonds up to a certain point in time, and then some of them can be exchanged for bonds up to maybe even a later or sooner point in time. So it's a very convoluted act. But basically what ends up happening is that it cuts the stock of Confederate money by basically a third in April 1863, which is why then we see that deflation that kicks off in the second quarter of 1864 and kind of lasts until September of that same year.
So how is it possible that real seigniorage goes negative during this period? Essentially the Confederacy was spending real resources that they could have been spending on mini balls to get inflation in check. How did they do that, and how did that work?
So the way to think about seigniorage is essentially it's a similar relationship to a tax rate and a tax base. So the tax rate in this case, let's abstract for a second away from the peculiar nature of the Confederate currency, and let's just focus on a purely fiat currency. The tax rate is going to be the rate of inflation, right? And per the quantity theory of money, the rate of inflation will be determined 1-for-1 with the growth rate of the money supply, right? So the inflation rate is akin to the tax rate in this case. The tax base is essentially the supply of real money balances. So again, supply of real money balances, you can think of that as the purchasing power of money. Mathematically, it's just the quantity of money divided by some price index, right? So the amount that you can tax is the size of how much people is how much people money are holding, and then the size of the tax rate is the rate at which their stock of real money balances is depreciating. Now, the key point about money demand, right, is that especially in inflationary environments, we tend to think of the primary determinant as the inflation rate, right? So as the inflation rate goes up, your willingness to hold money is going to fall. So essentially what happened in the case of the third currency reform, because there was deflation, that's essentially like a negative tax rate. So to answer your question, how is it that seigniorage goes negative? Well, seigniorage goes negative because the reform essentially resulted in a temporary negative tax rate. And as a result, seigniorage also then becomes negative.
Okay, so when you have inflation, it's essentially a transfer from the holders of money to the monetary authority. Deflation is that in reverse. It's effectively a transfer from the monetary authority, which is pulling notes out of circulation, to the people who still hold notes, which are now more valuable in real terms.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So let's talk about the politics of these reforms, which is kind of the main thrust of your paper. So you mention in the paper that people in the Confederate Congress who represented territory that was not actually controlled by the Confederacy. This is a strange thing. Like, imagine if Hawaii was annexed by, or imagine that Canada annexed Alaska. Would Alaska still have 2 senators? And what would they do exactly? Well, that's basically the kind of thing that was happening in the Confederacy. They had politicians who effectively didn't represent anyone anymore because the country they were part of didn't control the territory they were representing. Why? Well, first, how do you show that effect? And second, why do you think that was the case?
Sure. Okay. So there's actually a pretty interesting literature on this, which is basically that, look, the behavior of Confederate legislators was essentially not independent of whether or not they actually represented an area that was outside of Confederate control. And this has been applied to a lot of things. So trade policy, for example, Bob Eklund and some co-authors have a piece in Public Choice about this called "Desperation Votes and Private Interests: An Analysis of Confederate Trade Legislation." Some political scientists have looked at this as well, of saying, like, look, how did the voting patterns of Confederate legislators, change when their district became occupied by or disrupted by the Union? And so a very simple example would be the following, that legislators who represented areas that were no longer under Confederate control were more likely to support funding for legislator housing. Right. So they were basically saying, like, look, if you want me to represent my area, such as it is, right, it's no longer within our sovereignty, so to speak, you need to pay for me to get an apartment in Richmond, which is where the Confederate Congress met. So that's just a very simple example, but this has been applied to a lot of things. Like I said, trade policy, tax policy, so on and so forth. So what we do is the following. So to follow the argument here, to keep in mind a couple of things. So the first is that as the Union's advancing into the South, it has a policy of forcing Graybacks out of the areas that it occupies. So the easiest way to think of this is that as the Union comes in, basically the greenbacks that we're circulating, in some cases were, as far as I've seen some evidence of where they're explicitly packed up by the Union and sent into the Confederacy's interior. Right. Other cases, people just try to get rid of it as soon as they can because they know it'll be contraband. And then they try to exchange it for real goods that can't be then confiscated by the Union as it comes into the area, right? So there's that issue to keep in mind. So the thing is that because the notes themselves represent a promise to pay gold at some point in the future, reducing the growth rate of these notes is essentially akin to reducing taxes, right? It's actually reducing your future tax liability. So if the South is successful, right, and in winning the war or however that looks, right? If the South establishes itself as its own sovereign nation, then what ends up happening is that if they reduce the rate at which they're printing money today, that means they're going to have to purchase less gold in the future to repay the note holders, right? So you're reducing people's future tax liability by reducing the growth rate of Treasury notes. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So now it's true that everybody would benefit from that to a certain extent, whether you lived in the interior of the Confederacy or whether you lived in the outskirts of the Confederacy. That's true. That would be a reduction of your future tax liability. The issue, however, is that some people had a large quantity of Confederate Treasury notes in their asset portfolios. Those people were concentrated in the interior of the Confederacy. On the other hand, there was a group of people that did not have, for whom Graybacks did not make up a significant part of their asset portfolio. So if you were to engage in this type of partial repudiation that happens in these currency reforms, and the third one in particular, it would have had a differential effect on whether or not your asset portfolio included graybacks. So those people who lived on the exterior of the Confederacy, they don't have, to a very great extent, graybacks in their asset portfolio. Whereas those who are in the interior, that's a significant part of how they're storing their wealth, right? So if you pass this law, it's not as if it affects everybody in the Confederacy equally. In fact, it has a disproportionate effect on those people living in the interior of the Confederacy. They're going to bear the primary cost of this reform because they're the South's primary creditors. In this sense, they're creditors because they're holding Treasury notes that are promises to pay gold at some point in the future. So what my co-author and I argue is that this basically bifurcated the interests of the Confederate Congress into two groups, one who represented the Confederacy's exterior, and then the other group who represented the Confederacy's interior. And this was noted at the time, so it's not like we've uncovered something new, really. The representatives at the time already had identified that the people from the exterior of the Confederacy were the ones who were primarily agitating for more drastic reforms, and it was those people in the interior, or those representatives in the interior, who were trying to moderate the effort. So basically what my co-author and I do is we say, well, this is a pretty simple test, right? We can say, look, does representing a state that is either occupied or disrupted by the Union increase the likelihood that a legislator would vote for currency reform or not? This is just a pretty simple question. And what we do is we look at the final currency reform. Now, let me take a step back real quick. We only have voting records for the final currency reform, both the initial proposal and the final version that passed. The previous two, 1 and 2, the currency reforms 1 and 2, were taken in secret. So we actually don't know who voted for them. So we can only really look at the third one, which is obviously an issue. But we look at the third one, and then what we do is we control for a whole host of factors. So we actually know a lot about the representatives of the Confederate Congress. So we know, for example, their political party. We know what their views on secession were. We know whether they were lame ducks or not. We know how many slaves they owned, the value of their estates. We know what their professions were. We also know a lot about their district. So we knew, for example, how intensity was slavery in their district. What about land values in their district? And then what was the primary agricultural output in their district? Mainly cotton and tobacco. Those are the two things we're looking at. So we control for all of those things. We say that now, controlling for all those things, what effect did being from an area that was occupied or disrupted by the Union, how did that affect their vote? So what we find is that for the initial proposal, which was even the more drastic version, it increased a legislator's likelihood of voting for the reform by 94%. And then we look at the second one, and we see a similar pattern. What we see then is instead of 94%, we see 91%. The point is that the overwhelming factor that influenced a legislator's support for the currency reforms was whether or not they actually represented an area that was no longer under Confederate control.
So I kind of thought you were going to go a different direction with that, like, if the Confederacy does not control the place that you represent, then you're sort of not accountable, and, your position will not exist if they can't take it back or come to some kind of peace deal. But I suppose people, conditional on the outcome of the war, you'd still be accountable to the people in your district. Just once things concluded, you might run for office again, however things turn out. And so the story you're telling then is that if the Union captured your district, people got rid of Confederate currency, and so then your constituents no longer lose their assets in the case of a repudiation of the currency, which they have already gotten rid of.
That's correct.
All right. So that's some interesting political economy. People try, even at the height of this war, the Confederate government wasn't just trying to win at all costs. They were also keeping in mind, the assets of, protecting the value of the assets held by the people in their districts. Quite, it's quite interesting. Do you have any sort of big picture conclusions from this? Anything we might take about it, learn about, like, public choice in general, or even monetary economics?
Sure. So let me just take just a brief step back. There's another the subsequent part of the paper. So what originally motivated this paper, the question that motivated it, wasn't actually the political economy. It was something that we kind of uncovered that as we were working on this other question. So the initial question was very simple. It was the Confederacy maximizing the revenue from seigniorage or not? Right, and we have standard monetary theories about when that occurs, but the simplest way to describe it is that a monetary authority will maximize the revenue from seigniorage when the demand for money is unit elastic. And that's pretty intuitive, right? Because if the marginal cost of producing money is zero, right, it's going to be where marginal revenue is zero, right? And that's going to be where demand for the notes is unit elastic. So we started off by wondering, well, look, okay, fine. We have this 5,000% increase in the price level over the course of the war. The quantity of notes increases by 780%. Could it be the case that they actually didn't print enough money? Or in other words, did they leave money on the table, so to speak? Could they have done even better than what they did? Now, in the process of researching that question, we come across this whole interesting political economy thing. So the answer to our first question, by the way, is that they weren't maximizing the revenue from seigniorage. Then, of course, that raises a question. Well, why? Well, then that's when the political economy story comes in. So what we find is that the currency reforms actually reduce the flow of seigniorage. Now, if you see in the paper, we have a nice little, I call it a Bailey curve, but most people will probably think of it more as a quote unquote Laffer curve. Bailey, because he's the first economist to name it before Art Laffer came up with his notion. But the point is, if the Confederacy was printing too much money from the perspective of trying to maximize the revenue from seigniorage, then the currency reform should have actually increased the flow of seigniorage. But it didn't. And what we find is that it actually decreased. So what we conclude is the following. The South wasn't maximizing the revenue from seigniorage. And the reason that it adopted these reforms was because of this split in the Confederate legislature that led to basically varying interests across the Confederacy, where it was essentially it was in the interest of these different groups to adopt different policies. And that ultimately our view is that it deprived the Confederacy of much needed revenue. And as a result, may have contributed to the speed with which they lost the war. I mean, it's difficult to come up with these counterfactuals, but I wouldn't be surprised, for example, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that had they not adopted these currency reforms, the war may have lasted a bit longer than what it did.
Which is, yeah, almost certainly for the best for everyone. It's
agreed. Yes, agreed.
If you're going to lose a war, you don't want it to last as long as possible. You'd rather lose it quick so that you can cut your losses and get back to productive peacetime economy.
Exactly.
But yeah, so it makes intuitive sense. There were, they're going to set the marginal cost equal to the marginal benefit of producing new currency, and that marginal cost is not just the cost of printing it, but all the costs, all things considered, including these political factors. And so what you've shown is that the marginal cost of expanding the money supply was greater than zero. And so, the optimal and what they actually ended up doing was to not maximize their revenue from seigniorage, but to somewhat less, produce somewhat less than the amount that it would take to maximize it, because getting that last bit of seigniorage just was not worth the cost.
Yeah, I think that's one. I think that you could look at it that way. That when you start bringing in the political economy aspects of it, that it's not this kind of simple, just produce where the demand for money is unit elastic, right? I mean, maybe a dictator who was singularly focused on, whose objective function was to maximize the revenue from seigniorage might do that. But once you introduce, the democratic decision making, right, then it becomes a little bit more difficult to actually try to both identify and then pursue a clearly defined objective function.
Yeah, even a dictator has to, keep an eye to
True.
staying in power. But if we imagine some, a dictator that wasn't worried about that and had no concerns besides the cost of the paper that notes were printed on, then yeah, they just maximize the profit or maximize revenue, which are the same thing when your cost is zero. Yeah. So, do you have any closing thoughts before we conclude our conversation?
I don't think so. I mean, one thing I will say is that I think that, and this perhaps is my own naivete, but a lot of political public choice scholars, or at least in my own mind, I always thought of public choice as kind of being this more modern type of phenomena, right? And of course that makes sense because kind of the intellectual context within which public choice theory emerges is kind of lots of regulations in the United States in the 1960s. The point is that I think these dynamics apply to a whole host of historical events. And it's not to say that there's not a literature out there that applies the insights of public choice theory to a variety of historical periods. There is. It's just that for me, I had never really thought about it that much. And this project kind of uncovered that. So, for your listeners, I'm a fourth-year graduate student just trying to figure my way out through how all of this works. And one of the things that I would encourage those of you who are listening who are graduate students, if you're interested in public choice theory, I think history offers a huge opportunity for research of applying these kind of public choice political economy insights to important historical events. And you get to combine history, public choice theory. In this case, my other field is monetary economics. So for me, this was a perfect storm of getting to put together all the things that I'm interested in. So if you're a graduate student and you're looking for topics and you like political economy or public choice, look to history. I think there's a lot of cool work that can be done there.
Hear, hear. My guest today has been Bryan Cutsinger. Bryan, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me.